A new identity is emerging in the United States. But how do these individuals fit into society? They don't belong to one group, but multiple groups.
The one ethnic versus the other ethnic. And so how do you balance that? If you don't know the language, can you still be thought of yourself as part of that ethnic group?
How being biracial in America affects our cultural identity. That issue coming right up on Equal Time.
From San Jose State University, you're watching Equal Time, exploring new issues each week, giving equal time to competing points of view.
Hello from the campus of San Jose State University, and welcome to this edition of Equal Time. I'm your host, Journalism School Director Bob Rucker. The number of mixed-race people has been increasing over the years, and San Jose is one of the most dramatic examples. But what's happening to cultural identity? Jessica Savage reports on the confusion regarding that identity.
In this installment of Olivia Tech NEB 2012 coverage, we get a sneak peek at Roscoe's Light Loop.
Olivia Speranza hosts a technology blog, but often answers a completely different kind of question from her audience.
I get asked a lot, oh, what ethnicity are you?
Speranza is half Japanese and half Italian and is part of the new, fast-growing mixed-race population of the United States.
As a public figure, being in the media, I feel zero pressure to either be a little bit more Asian or a little bit more white.
She is caught up in the confusion over racial identity resulting from America stirring the melting pot to the boiling point. San Jose State communications professor Dr. Jennifer Wynn Tian Morrison says mixed-race people are under pressure to choose their identity, even though it's not so black and white.
It's hard to tell who's of which race, and we still want someone to choose one race.
I think that it's a human condition to want to know what an answer is. You know, we want to know, okay, well, this is right and this is wrong because I'm going to find some assurance in that.
Speranza is keeping her real last name of Italian origin, but many media personalities who will remain nameless here in the Bay Area have chosen ethnic names, typically their mother's maiden name, if it will work to a personal advantage.
We then struggle with, do we want to be mixed race and only mixed, or do we want to showcase and highlight particular aspects of our identity that we can take advantage of in that moment?
This idea of strategic advantage is just how society works.
We create networks in order to help us in our careers and in our lives. We showcase particular parts of our identity to help us navigate easier throughout different moments while we're in those structures, while we're entertaining the idea of who we are with someone else.
Speranza says her white and Asian friends do act differently, and she wonders if she fits into their patterns when she's with them.
Who am I when I'm with this group? Who am I when I'm with this group? Do I act differently?
Over the years, she has felt more Japanese at times and at other times more Italian. But her mother never put pressure on her cultural identity.
It's up to them because I know they won't listen to me.
Yes, I am living proof that even when your mom is Japanese from Japan and your dad from across the globe is Italian and from, Pennsylvania, and you are a product of that, that doesn't mean that you always have to feel a divide in your life or that you always have to feel torn.
She is not alone. According to the latest U.S. Census, 9 million people identify themselves as belonging to more than one race, making up 3% of the total population, an increase of about 1/3 between 2000 and 2010. And with all of the mixtures of cultures, a sociologist will show us why it's more important than ever for people of mixed race to know their history.
When we come back, we'll show you the upside of the racially mixed society we live in. Welcome back. Biracial people are becoming the norm in America, but how is society accepting this new identity? We continue our look at multi-ethnic individuals and the impact they're having on society. Once again, Jessica Savage.
You sign up, you receive a kit like this in the mail.
Joanna Mountain is the director of research at 23andMe, a personal genetics company in Mountain View. The company tests DNA samples.
We provide people with their DNA information and the health and ancestry interpretations of that information, because the A's, T's, C's, and G's of your genome really aren't very meaningful without this interpretation.
All the customer needs to do is spit into this tube and mail it back to their offices. The results can be surprising.
We have people discovering that even though they thought all their ancestry traced to Europe, that they have some ancestry tracing to the Americas, to Native Americans, or to Africa.
While technology is making it easier for people to identify their roots, many people of mixed race are still caught between multiple worlds. That's a focus of an SJSU sociologist here at Clark Hall.
So the most difficult part about balancing your multiple identity or multiple racial identity is actually knowing where they're from and what they do, but also deciding which ones they want to embrace.
Dr. Hindo specializes in race relations and says mixed race people should adopt a certain attitude.
Hey, I am different, but I'm better and I am multiple things.
It's an individualistic attitude.
Because you want to be able to express to people that I don't want to be put in a certain category. I will myself define what that is.
Dr. Doe says very few multicultural organizations operate here in Northern California, simply because it's California.
We tend to be very complacent in California. We think that because we're so liberal, so diverse, that everybody's accepted. And so maybe multiracial folks don't think that there's a need to organize.
Olivia Speranza, the web blogger we met earlier, grew up in California amid feelings of acceptance.
I was never treated different. I never heard any racial anything, and if it existed, it never hit my ears.
And finally, back to the original question, when people ask her what ethnicity she is, she simply replies,
I'm Olivia. I'm Olivia Speranza, and this is what I love, and this is what I do. And when somebody asks me who I am, what my ethnicity is, it's because they want to know at that point, and those things carry on.
When we come back, we'll talk to a panel of experts when Equal Time returns. Our focus today is on mixed race identity. Let's meet our guests.
I'm Dr. Hindo, Professor of Asian American Studies at San Jose State University.
I'm Dr. Jennifer Wynn-Tian Morrison. I'm a lecturer in the Communication Studies Department at San Jose State University.
I'm Olivia Speranza. I am a blogger for a video and photo website, oliviatech.com, and on-air personality.
I'm Jessica Savage. I'm the researcher and reporter for the story that you saw earlier.
Jessica is also responsible for that setup piece that we saw earlier. It was very good, and I'm curious to know what made you want to do this program?
Well, I wanted to do this story specifically because I am biracial and because I felt like a lot of my friends, when I asked them, you know, like, what are you? They're all mixed race now. I mean, everybody I know is mixed race, yet no one really talks about this group in general and how it affects their cultural identity and, you know, outlets for them if there are issues with them growing up, you know, being mixed race.
And we thought it'd be interesting for this part of the program to look at the Asian American mixed cultural identity. And help me out with this, folks. Is there a, I wouldn't want to call it a concern, but how do you identify that way? How do people see it?
Well, I think it depends because the way that it's been structured in our society, it's been evolving. It used to be that you only have black and white or different types of interracial, but now we have not just Japanese and American and white, but you also have Vietnamese, you have Cambodian, you have a lot of different ethnic groups, and then you also have these other ethnic groups, including Latinos and so on. So the mixture is becoming much more sophisticated, it's becoming much more complex. And for us, I think we haven't yet figured out a way to talk about it. But for those who are multi-ethnic and multiracial, it's real. It's something that they have to deal with on a daily basis. But at the same time, they have all these different pressure. You have all these things that you go, wow, so what am I? And sometimes it's easy not to deal with it, and other times you have to deal with it. And for multiracial, multi-ethnic groups, a lot of times they have to deal with it on a daily basis.
Now, when I was in college, I remember this was an issue where people whispered a little bit about it, but we didn't talk very much about it. Have we grown up?
I think to a certain extent we've grown up, but that growing up changes over time. To kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Do has said, we negotiate our identities. We are multiracial and multi-ethnic, but when we get into certain contexts, depending on who we're with, what we're talking about, what are our investments in that discussion, we then decide which identity we want to showcase in that moment. So for example, I'm Vietnamese and white. My father is of a mixed European ancestry, so I could say I'm Scottish because Morrison links back to the Scottish clan in Scotland, but at the same time I don't have a strong connection with that. My mother, who raised me as being Vietnamese American, even though I don't speak the language, I am Buddhist, I know about the food, I grew up in the communities, and so I feel that when I talk about my identity, I say that I'm a Vietnamese American identity, and that embraces my multicultural background, yet people would look at me and still question it because of my light skin, because of my inability to speak the Vietnamese language to their standards. And that's a problem that I think is really at the forefront of identifying, well, why are we choosing particular identities in particular moments? And again, that comes back to where are we when we're talking about our identity?
That identity of who you are, is that still very important in our cultural world today?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, I think what you said is interesting because in many ways there's a notion of how we define ourselves, but there's also the notion of how others define us. And so our physical appearance is actually what people look at first, and they go, well, so what are you? And but by what are you, they don't mean like, what are you, a human being, but they try to figure out what is your combination. And I think, again, the media has a lot to do with changing that definition, either enhancing it or not enhancing it, or sometimes portraying it in negative ways. So during the earlier part of the interracial marriage, of course, there were laws that banned that. So for the biracial couples, that was very challenging. We have moved from that to now a little bit more acceptance. But I think this is danger for me in the sense that you also want people to be able to embrace a cultural background. There's certain value to the things, for example, that she talked about in terms of being a Buddhist, or being Vietnamese, or being Japanese, or being Italian, or Irish, and whatnot. But our society, I think, is not quite clear about how to deal with that. On one hand, we want us to be celebrating that. On the other hand, I think we want us to be homogenized, so that we want all people to be the same. But there's also this exoticization of these multiracial folks. So now you may not be consciously thinking about that, but the media thinks, oh, this is the latest thing that we want to portray, and so we're looking after that, right? So for Asian Americans, if you look at it historically, they've been denied access to a lot of the resources, and now it becomes sweep under the carpet, and now something moves on. And now it happens to be biracial or multiracial.
For people who don't have a clear idea of their background, for people who are not sure where their ethnic background is connected to, they may say, aren't you asking really for special privilege because you do know who you are and the government or some agency with a form will give you that privilege that we don't necessarily have?
Again, this privilege that we're talking about, anyone can embody that. You know, we have this idea of, in our society, of this idea of white privilege, and this is something that has moved away from skin color to be more institutionalized. You know, we don't call educational institutions the ivory tower just because it's full of white individuals. We have multiracial individuals here at San Jose State University, yet there are still certain privileges based off of socioeconomic status, as well as religion, and also just who you know and networking that really allow you to get entrance into particular places for any given reason, whether it's educational, for work, or just to get to know someone else so that you can have one leg up on your next experience. What we're talking about here transcends race a bit. Race, many people have said we've become so multicultural that we have become colorblind, and that is something that I've read about in newspapers and journals for many years now, yet I still see racism on this campus. I still see racism when I walk down the street in my own neighborhood that I grew up in. So how do we then move away from that? And people would say, well, we must embrace multiculturalism, multiracialism. But at the same time, we then move away from it when we identify ourselves, because we don't want to expose an identity that we have that could hinder our ability to gain access to certain privileges. So in a way, we're looking at two very large, heavy stones here. One, dealing with our own identities and how we negotiate that in our everyday lives, as well as how we negotiate those multiple identities within structures that give us certain privileges in society. So in a way, it's kind of a teeter-totter back and forth, a negotiation, and that negotiation is what's important of how we then decide on where we're going to go with which identity. Yes, I mean, I still see racism.
On this campus?
Yes, on this campus.
Now let me ask Jessica, as a student, how do you react to that? As a student, do you experience that? Do you see that?
I mean, I feel like the racism on this campus isn't as blatant as it used to be. It's more institutional discrimination and racism for me. I mean, it's become so part of our society that we don't even notice when we're being racist or when we're discriminating. Even jokes that I hear on campus, especially towards Asians or even African Americans or Caucasian people, I mean, it's funny, but to someone else it could be very hurtful, very hurtful. And no one wants to speak up though, because again, you don't want to be that person to be like, well, that was discriminating, that was racist, and you don't want to be that person to point that finger. So I think as a young person, I think the way we're dealing with our identity is by taking these negative terms and turning it into a joke and kind of sweeping it under the carpet, as Dr. Doe was saying. I really do think that's what we're doing as in my generation. And it's something that has bothered me a little bit, and this is why it drove me to do this story, because I want to bring it to light, and I want to say that that's not okay. And just like saying that it's okay for an Asian to make a racist Asian joke, whereas if a Caucasian man said that, or a female, you're racist. So it's those issues.
Olivia looks like she wants to say something.
Yeah, just to kind of segue from that, I feel like this is also the perfect time right now in this moment, I think, for everyone to take accountability and to take the responsibility as far as, do I want to contribute to the negativity of the race issue, or do I want to take this in the direction of love and acceptance and just sort of like kind of embracing people as individuals. And I think as with any real issue, it really boils down to, as an individual, your responsibility, the accountability that you take. So for me, I'm listening to everyone, and everyone has these great points, but I still feel really convicted. And when I say, I understand the value that falls on, sort of taking stock and keeping with some of the, let's say, Japanese culture that I have, that my mom introduces. But really, when we practice certain things on the holidays, it's not just Japanese culture, because we have my dad there and we have us there, and we incorporate some of the things that I do now, like veganism or whatever. So it just sort of, it's starting to morph, and I feel like you can sort of have both and have a convergence of something that's like new. We're here in California, I'm not in Japan, I'm not, just this or just that. So I see the value in sort of keeping your roots intact, but at the same time, I feel like really sort of embracing that mix really is important.
Then why aren't we talking about this and stop whispering about it or not? We worry so much about offending. We worry so much about that, and we shut down that communication.
Well, I think it's not just offending, but I think it's also, for me as a sociologist, it's the fear about the historical amnesia that we face, that I think you are absolutely right, that as multiracial group, you can actually define that, and that's the beauty and that's the challenge for you as individuals. But I think that structurally and socially, there's still things that are imposed on us. I'll give you a very simple example. President Obama, biracial, right? We still try to put him as a first African-American president. That's 2012 still, right? The fact that he is not seen as part of our society. His children, I don't know how they're gonna be defined. I have 2 kids. I'm Vietnamese, my wife is biracial. She's Japanese, and then her father is from the Mayflower. Our kids will have to negotiate the exact same thing that some of you are negotiating, except it will be different. But I want them to be able to remember what it was like for all the struggles that those who went before us went through to try to get to where you are now, where you can choose to say, yes, I want to be this or I want to be that, as opposed to, no, you're going to be this regardless of what you say. Right? It was against the law for people who love one another to marry because of their race. Now we don't think about that. But that wasn't that long ago. That was within our lifetime.
Yeah.
Right. So that's
I definitely I think about that because like my dad, I was saying earlier, my dad is half white and half Japanese, and his father was a part of the Mormon Church. My white side is very religious, and you know, when his parents got married, my grandmother wasn't allowed into the Mormon Church, into the temple where my dad got baptized, and so my grandfather made the decision to excommunicate himself from the church. Because he said, you know, it's how come my own wife can't go into the temple to see her own son get baptized? Because they didn't think that she was pure enough. So, I mean, it's that big issue. You have to remember the struggles, and I think that's also kind of what drives me as far as trying to find that mix, like what Olivia is saying, because I want to find that mix. I don't feel like I have that yet, and I haven't answered that question. And so I'm trying to pave that path where I can finally say that I am both, but it's hard to find that mix. And like I said, I identify more as a Japanese American. If people ask me, I usually say, yes, I'm Japanese American, but they see my name, Jessica Savage, they're like, well, what else are you? You're not just Japanese, it's a very white name.
In my most recent research for my dissertation, I worked on Vietnamese identity, and I spoke with many younger generation Vietnamese Americans, and we talked about this historical amnesia because of the Vietnam War and the stigma that's still there, unfortunately, in this country and around the globe. We have this idea that there's something that we need to forget, right? It's so taboo. The U.S. went in and tried to help, and now they weren't able to help completely, so it's all hush-hush. So a lot of the immigrants that came here, either from the North or the South, they don't want their children to remember it or have to go through the same struggles that they did. So they don't tell them about the history of how their family moved from Vietnam to here. And so these children, this next generation, who have a kind of a multicultural background, not just multiracial, but being Americans and being born and raised here, they find themselves struggling on who I am, who am I, and where do I go from here? So in a way, they're kind of creating this new identity out of what they can find within history, from their parents, from their peers. So when I was doing my research, I found myself being kind of the historian, being the person that everyone would say, so what do you know about the Vietnam War? Tell me more. My parents won't tell me about it. We know, and I hear things like better read than, than dead. And I'm like, wow, where did you hear this kind of stuff? They say, well, we read about it, but it's so taboo. We can't research Ho Chi Minh because he's so taboo. Yet at one time, he really did help make Vietnam an independent country from the French. So at a time, again, it's very contextual. When are we trying to negotiate our identities? When are we trying to, build that multicultural self? And I see the next generation really embodying that, saying, we need to embrace all of it, both the good and the bad, both what happened in history as well as where we're going to go in the future.
Don't we need to do that, Olivia, to help people understand, yes, it is important to have a foundation in history?
I totally agree. And I remember when Obama was announced president, I was crying, and to me, again, what Dr. Doe was saying, we identify Obama as our first black president, but, to me, that's honoring that struggle, because it is true. He's the first black president. Yes, he has, he's of mixed race, but that is a huge, that's leaps and bounds from where we were not that long ago. So for me, even though, I've never been in this struggle of, am I black, am I white? I never even really have personally experienced a struggle, am I Japanese or am I Italian? I can still understand, just because I know, again, the history and the background of what our country went through, and what, the civil rights movement and all of these things. So what that means, those implications for the very fact that we have President Obama as our president, I think it's extremely important for people to understand that struggle, because it really, it builds that foundation of, like, you know, we weren't just handed this on a silver platter, like, hey, this is your God-given right, you can do whatever you want, what it should be. But I think now, yes, let's honor those things and those struggles, but at the same time, and maybe this is like super hippie of me, but I just feel like, you know, let's just embrace at this point. You know, let's not, and again, this is just from my personal, you know, when I go back to Pennsylvania, where my Italian side is, people look at me like I'm an alien sometimes. They're like, we don't know what you are. We've never seen anybody with dark skin. You know, everyone thinks I'm Mexican. And so I understand that, and I have lived that in a sense. But for me, it's like, oh, hi, I'm Olivia. And I think it's also the way in which we present ourselves and the way in which we communicate and we interact with people. I think that's really important. And again, that falls on like, how do we choose to take accountability and responsibility for who we are? How do we choose to represent ourselves?
I put huge emphasis on the past because this Japanese Americans specifically, because I've been trying to reconnect with that culture. You know, the Nisei, the second generation, they don't talk. They didn't talk for years. I mean, my parents, which are third generation, are the Sansei. They were asking, yes, Sansei. So they were asking the question of what happened, and they wouldn't say anything. And my grandfather did, because he was in the 442nd, he didn't talk to me about all the racism he faced until he was in his 80s. So I, you know, just not knowing what they went through, and then finally, you know.
So how do we in the business world really value diversity instead of a numbers count? We have these many blacks, these many Latinos, these many Asians. How do we go beyond that?
See, I think to me that's the $60 million question. I think the way that our society works is very much at the surface, the representation at the surface. And I think the fear that I have is, while I celebrated the fact that we had a black president, what I was fearful of is that we were going to no longer talk about race. And this is what happens with multiracial folks sometimes. It's easier to dismiss it and to say, no, I'm just an individual, I'll make my own way, as opposed to understanding that our society is still very much based on race. Look at Jeremy Lin, right? He's not the first Asian American basketball player in the NBA. He was not. Exactly. And yet we celebrate him. Yeah. We still are stuck in that mode, and yet at the same time we want to dismiss it. We want to sort of come across as if things are fine now. Yeah. We have a black president, we have an Asian American NBA player, but there's all this violence that are inflicted upon certain groups, right? African American, Asian American, Latinos, and so on. And the multiracial folks are sort of almost a ping pong ball in some ways, that they can be used to address that. Like, no, we have no longer racism because these folks are doing so well, they're multiracial, they're advancing, they're doing all these things. Or on the other hand, you can say a lot of times they're not being accepted, right? And that's still, to me, the fear that I have. You're right. I want my children to be strong individuals, but I also want them to recognize the fact that, you know what, it's not just about me, it's also about the larger society, and how do we change that? To make it so that one day, when Dr. King said, the content of our character, that's exactly what he meant. But until that day comes, we're still going to have to struggle with that.
And I want to take it one more step further, because I grew up admiring Dr. King, and my parents, my father, and all of that, and I was thinking, I'd like to see us incorporate cultural ideas in policy making, so that we're not only experienced by being seen, but also by a variety of ways we're incorporated. With that, I thank you all for being with us today. It was a great discussion, and we thank you for joining us. Join us again for another edition of Equal Time.